Good evening. My name is Graham Smith. I'm the Professor of Oral History at Newcastle and lead the Oral History Unit and Collective. Tonight's lecture celebrates the third year of our collective based at Newcastle. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of our colleagues, research partners and interviewees across a range of projects in Britain, as well as in Vietnam, Bangladesh and India. It's therefore with great pleasure that I welcome on behalf of the collective at Newcastle University, Professor Indira Chowdhury, who will tonight deliver our third annual Oral History Insights lecture. I will be back after the lecture for a live Q&A with the speaker. If you would like to submit a question, you may do so via the YouTube live chat box on your screen or via Twitter at InsightsNCL. If you are tweeting about the event and want to share your thoughts, please use hashtag InsightsNCL. Now you'll see a short introduction from me, which will be followed by Indira's lecture, After Displacement, Journeys of the Mind and Memory Communities. Thank you. Indira is the founder director of the Centre for Public History at the Srishti-Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. Formerly Professor of English at Jadavpur University in Kolkata, she's also the founder of Archival Resources for Contemporary History. Her book, The Frail, Hero and Virile History, Gender and Politics of Culture in Colonial Bengal, won the Tagore Prize in 2001. She was subsequently awarded the New India Fellowship to work on a manuscript which turned into the Growing the Tree of Science, Homi Bhabha and the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. As well as numerous other literary projects, she has also created publications that bring archival material to the public. She researched and directed a book project on Asia's oldest museum entitled The Lives of Objects, Stories from the India Museum 2016. Indira is a founding member of the Oral History Association of India and was president of that association between 2013 and 2016, as well as being president of the International Oral History Association. She's also the author of beautifully written reflections on oral history in a series of blogs that range from joy to melancholy. The language she uses is musical, the insights deeply informed by all the listening Indira, the oral historian, has undertaken. In noting that often the voice of memory enables us to reconstruct in our imagination what the scene might have looked like in the past, she adds that oral history is, quote, a process of transmission that transforms our understanding of our own life events, past or present. Tonight we have the opportunity to listen to Indira as she presents After Displacement, Journeys of the Mind and Memory Communities. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Graham Smith, Professor of Oral History at Newcastle University, and the Oral History Centre and Collective for inviting me to give the Insights lecture. It is indeed a privilege to be invited to present here, as I have read with great interest the kind of work being done by the Centre and the Collective. The pandemic has, of course, restricted us to such virtual meetings, but I hope there will be a time soon when I shall be able to meet and have discussions with many of you face to face. I have titled my talk After Displacement, Journeys of the Mind and Memory Communities. I shall focus on the Partition of India, 1947, and memory and processes of meaning-making that oral history interviews alert us to. Our present situation, where all that was once familiar has become remote and unrecognizable, perhaps puts us in a better position to understand the kind of role memory plays in anchoring communities that are displaced, forced to relocate and rebuild their homes and identities in places that were once distant and unfamiliar. In this photograph, we see Mahatma Gandhi, along with Abdul Khan Ghaffar Khan, the gentle Pashtun freedom activist, often called Frontier Gandhi, walking through Jahanabad in Bihar in March 1947, 5 months before the Partition of India. Riots had devastated Jahanabad. This photograph is iconic, but the context of the photograph seems to augur what followed. The riots and the bloodshed that came in the wake of Partition of India and independence of India. This photograph also raises an interesting question about the journey of a nation to create citizens and hints at the journeys that the displaced were beginning to embark on. The history textbooks of independent India would speak only about one of these journeys and for decades silence the other. Those of us who were born in independent India would be continuously reminded of Nehru's famous speech as he inaugurated a new nation.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Gandhi was absent from these celebrations. He was fasting in Calcutta, where communal violence had erupted almost a year prior to the Indian independence. And this violence had continued, and it continued even after partition was implemented. Partition was implemented on 17th August 1947, that is 2 days after India became independent. Gandhi was also fasting that day, as he felt most of the peasants in India did not have the resources to celebrate. In this photograph, he is covering his ears to shut out the noise from outside where an angry mob had gathered. The Radcliffe Line, which demarcated the boundary between India and Pakistan, was published on 17th August 1947. The line was named after Sir Cyril Radcliffe, chairman of the two boundary commissions, one in the east in Bengal and the other in the west in Punjab. Radcliffe was in charge of dividing the territory and 88 million people. The task had to be completed within 5 weeks of his arrival in India on 8 July 1947. With the establishment of the Radcliffe Line, the British had created what Urvashi Butalia, one of the first scholars to write on the partition, has called one of the great human convulsions of history. In her words, never before or since have so many exchanged their homes and countries so quickly. The coming of independence on 15th August 1947 brought with it the creation of Pakistan, and 12 million people became refugees moving between India and East and West Pakistan. This forced migration of the Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities was accompanied by slaughter and violence. Contemporary British estimates of the dead was 200,000, but it is now accepted that 1 million people died in the riots or of starvation and disease. About 75,000 women were abducted and raped, and thousands of families divided. For the generation that witnessed partition, either because they experienced partition themselves, or saw the refugees pouring into their cities, the partition was a reality to be lived with. The history that my generation was taught at school ended with India's independence, and then we learned civics. The refugee experience was not included in the history textbooks of independent India. It was only in 1998 when pioneers like Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin began to publish oral histories about people's experiences during partition that the silence was broken. Since then, there have been many studies of the partition and oral histories of the partition in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh continue to be done now. In this talk, I shall be looking at the work that is focused on the displaced communities in India. When Urvashi Butalia began doing her work on the partition, she realized that what she was looking at was not just a political divide or a division of properties or assets and liabilities. It was also, she says, to use a phrase that survivors use repeatedly, a division of hearts. It brought untold suffering, tragedy, trauma, pain and violence to communities who had hitherto lived together in some kind of social contract. It separated families across an arbitrarily drawn border, sometimes overnight, and made it practically impossible for people to know if their parents, sisters, brothers, or children were alive or dead. Now, this is from a more recent work by Anchal Malhotra called Remnants of a Separation. And this is interesting because it makes the point that I want to make here about refugees and the way they built the cities they came into. And the relationship of refugees to Delhi was this, where this is an interview with Anchal Malhotra's grandfather, Balram Bahari, who's the founder of the famous bookstore in Delhi. He said to her, independence forced us to flee, made us refugees, but Delhi forced us to stand up on our feet. We had no choice. We have eaten the anaj, the ration of refugees. We have endured the hardships married to that label, and we have risen above it. Delhi is responsible for that. It has molded us into the people, the family, the business we are today. Never forget that in the blood of independent Delhi flows the unending and tireless sacrifices made by the refugees who poured into its landscape during the partition. We have built the city and it has built us. Now, this identity of the refugee is not something the people who become the victims of partition take very well. They are very upset by this tag, as we can see in the interview that Anchal Malhotra publishes. He says, oh, that hated word, refugee. I didn't want to be a refugee. But the partition that happened on both sides of India's border, on the eastern side, there was some complication because there were people who opted to stay behind and later came into India. And one such family was the family of Sunanda Sikdar, who wrote a memoir called, which in English is called A Life Long Ago, but in Bangla, in Bengali, it is called Doyamoyi Kotha. So the partition that separated families, her family was one of them, and she recounts how geographical boundaries gave birth to new ways of speaking about the landscape. And she recollects that she grew up in Digpait, which was a village in East Pakistan and now in Bangladesh. And she recollects her childhood visits to India, where she'd meet her siblings, her brother and her sister, who lived with the parents, whereas Sunanda continued to live with her foster mother, who she called Ma, but who was actually her aunt, who was a childless widow. Do you have rivers in your country? My brother asked. Of course, I said, we have many rivers, the Padma, Meghna, Buriganga, Dhaleshwari, Ichamati, and the Brahmaputra. And we have many other rivers in our country. And my brother said, those rivers have gone to your country from our Himalayas. If we block the source, you won't get any water in your country. Wait and see what happens to you folks then. With every passing year, I realized my brothers and sisters and my parents were very good people. However, I knew that they would never be part of my deepest joys and sorrows because I had my own private world, which I could never tell them about. And I think it is interesting that this argument is about rivers and it extends to an argument about, the prime ministers of both countries. And I think she's trying to reconstruct the kind of boundaries that are there in people's minds as a result of partition. These children who are otherwise siblings don't understand each other. They cannot relate to the landscape that Shunanda is very familiar with, because her siblings cannot relate to it because they've been brought up in urban Kolkata. Dayamoi, or as she calls herself, as Sunanda Shibdar takes her name in this memoir, refers to her homeland as Desh. And here is what she says about, people who are leaving the country just after partition. She said, as they left, they cried, "Buri, we are leaving. We are unlikely to ever meet anyone from here ever again. Do look us up when you too are in Hindustan." So these are her neighbors who leave before 1961, which is when she leaves. These are the neighbors who leave right around the time of partition. And she says, well, we did reach Hindustan finally, but we never again met any of them. We didn't know then that Hindustan was such a huge place and it was impossible to find anyone there. So for her, Desh is that locality, that village where she had grown up. And this is the place with which she has a cultural bond. It holds together the land of one's birth and growing up. It was also the land of her ancestors. It's the place to which one belongs culturally. It is Desh that evokes nostalgia. And it is this idea of Desh that contrasts sharply with history that the nation state envisions. The imagined community that Anderson had argued joins people into a historically constituted community, constructs its history with a vision for a future. But for the displaced, Desh or the homeland has a past. It does not exist in the present or in the future. It does not have a future. And I think this idea about the vastness of India, where you'll never see people who belong to your village again, is something that she cannot fathom. That, when they say, oh, we'll meet in that other place, she feels that other place might be, she's about 10 at that time, she's very young at that time. And she feels that, it will not, be the case that she'll not meet people from her Desh. But of course, when she finally leaves her village in what was East Pakistan, she finds she doesn't see them at all. And this leaving her Desh, I think she feels that her ma, her foster mother, was really, it tore her to give up the house, the land that she had, the animals that she took care of. And she felt, Sunanda Siddhar writes, that I looked at her face and promised myself I would never again speak of home, of Desh, our land. Ma and I never spoke of Desh again with each other. So this silence comes down on this mother-daughter pair who are very, very close otherwise. This is one promise I was able to keep. Until the day Ma died, I didn't say a word about home, about Desh. Sorry, our land. The filmmaker Ritwik Ghatak, who was born in Dhaka in 1925, saw that the independence of India came at a price, and he was unwilling to celebrate that independence. Almost all his films focused on the partition and its aftermath. In his films, the refugee can never find a foothold in this new nation state, and there are reasons for this. The nation state had created mechanisms that insisted that migrants embrace the new identity of refugee before being conferred citizenship. The Indian state also privileged physical violence over psychological violence and insisted, as Haimanti Roy tells us, that refugees from the East came to India for economic opportunities or because they feared violence. After all, they did not suffer violence as the refugees from West Pakistan did. This made the journey into citizenship an arduous and bitter one for those refugees who were in Eastern India. The identity of the refugee has come up again and again in the numerous oral history interviews I have conducted over the years. In 2014, I interviewed Kamala Mankekar, who was a social activist, writer, and one of the first women journalists in independent India, who spoke about the privileging of the term freedom fighter in India, that delegitimized the sacrifices the migrants made to build the new India. And when she talks to me, she is very clear that if the Hindus were butchered, so were the Muslims. But none of them spoke because she felt the government did not encourage that kind of, open speaking. But she says it was also the migrant attitude. I won't call them refugees. They were migrants. They did not beg, borrow, or seek charity. No, they were too proud a people, and they tried to re-establish themselves. And the rot had set in, she says, because the Congress leaders started thinking, most of whom were freedom fighters, started thinking that all the luxuries, that the resources of the countries should be at their beck and call. But she asks, what about the millions who had lost everything? They came like paupers. Were they not freedom fighters? Perhaps their sacrifices were far more than these so-called freedom fighters. And what did they get? Turning now to interviews I've done with my own family members, I would like to set the context for this. My father's family had worked in different parts of India from the 1930s onwards. After the partition, my great-grandfather, his sister, and my great-grandmother had opted to stay on in Kumilla, one of the largest cities in what became East Pakistan. But my great-grandfather remained part of our lives as the family visited him whenever they could, and he too visited us a couple of times. This map actually shows the distance and how this distance gets, there's a boundary that comes between. So Burnpur is where I grew up. It's a small steel town in West Bengal, and Kumilla is the land of my ancestors, where my great-grandfather and his family continued to live. This photograph is taken in 1954, where my father, who you see at the center standing, and my mother, who's next to this, my great-grandfather, this oldest man here sitting, they went to visit him during, right after they got married. And you can see the three women who are here, the two others, the oldest to the left and another person to the right, who's my great-grandmother, and the aunt, my father's great-grand aunt, who was, my great-grandfather's sister, sitting there in the front row. Now, this becomes possible, these visits become possible because from 1952, there's a passport regime. There's a joint India-Pakistan passport that was issued to migrants to be able to visit family, friends, and ancestral homes on the other side of the Radcliffe line. And this is actually a later passport, which shows my father to be a citizen of India, but it is also my very first passport, which documents, my first visit to Kumilla in 1961. The small industrial town I grew up in was set up by Martin Byrne and called Burnpur. Most members of the extended family had also moved there when my grandfather, a doctor, worked in the hospital. Our lives revolved around the factory and its timings, work at home and meal times being organized around the factory sirens that indicated the change of work shifts. As children, we thought that this was where we belonged and were puzzled by the talk about Desh, a homeland that was across the border. By contrast to this industrial town, the landscape of Desh, which was invoked, was rural or semi-urban. My father and his siblings spoke about the fish, varieties we had never seen on this side of the border, and about rivers and boat rides, which were not part of our everyday lives. But the family found other ways to keep alive the memories of the village they came from, a village not too far from Kumilla called Merkutta, now named Nobinagar. It was on the banks of the Titash, this village, but no one from the extended family ever visited it again. There exists no photographs of this village home in the family albums, but the memories of that village and its ways were kept alive through stories and also evoked in my aunt's photo album. The first page honors her grandparents, and they are surrounded by photographs of public figures who are not related. Freedom fighters such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, Chittaranjan Das, writers like Rabindranath Tagore and Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay, Ramakrishna Paramhamsa too, the 19th century mystic saint, and now faded photographs of landscape that they could never return to. This page perhaps is symbolic of all that my aunt valued and honored as her ancestors, those who belonged to her family, but those who also belonged to her land. There were other ways in which Desh was recreated in the house my grandfather built, always referred to by the family as the Basha, which is the Bengali word for nest and signified something temporary, because after all, their real home or their Desher Bari was their homeland, and that was in Kumilla or Merkutta, not in Burnpur. Some of the rituals that our family participated in needed certain types of leaves, certain roots, and certain herbs. The leaves of the jackfruit tree were needed for one such, and a jackfruit tree was planted and nurtured till it grew strong and supplied not just the leaves, but also the fruit in the summers. Turmeric, taro, small figs were always needed for rituals, and these roots and trees were planted and nurtured. The family had a cow and banana trees, but most of all, the recreation of Desh was done through stories that turned away from the narratives that the state constructed and expected new citizens to embrace. So this was the house before I was born, and you find that this actually is the house that reverberates with stories. And these stories are stories that I grew up hearing, though in school, it's another kind of history that I study. Debarati Chakravarti, in her interviews with refugees from East Pakistan who settled in Kolkata, talks about a similar nostalgic yearning for Desh, the homeland. She recounts how some of her interviewees had at one point after the partition decided to quit India and return to the town in East Pakistan where they had grown up. Because this was not the India they had imagined. Unable to return, many of them recreated their homeland through organizations they founded, often named after their homeland. And in that club or in that organization, they would keep alive the stories of that place. That, whatever was in the cuisine, the culture, all that was kept alive. Because they constantly remembered, compared and contrasted and mourned that place which they had left behind, a place which is more often than not referred to as Deshebari. Everyone who had to flee had an established sense of their own self and identity in the place where they lived and were well settled in their own homes. The milieu and the people situated in that time and space both are remembered now and here. So it is through organizations that people start doing this. So you have Borishal Shomnalini and all these different places, the different clubs and organizations that are created to honor Desh. Desh is revisited also through practices, especially through artisanal work and work done with one's hands. The creation of products out of kantha, embroidered cloth, is a relatively recent phenomenon in India and Bangladesh. It began more than a decade after the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. Kantha embroidery was usually done at home, and objects were created traditionally for household consumption. New products such as scarves, stoles, and bedspreads were made for commercial consumption by craft NGOs on both sides of the border. Shumita Biswas, who now makes a living from creating kantha embroidered cloth, was born in India of refugee parents in Khutiari Sharif in West Bengal, where her parents settled after partition. Now a resident of one of the suburbs of Kolkata, she recalls stories about kantha embroidery in villages of what is now Bangladesh. Shumita speaks of the history of her craft, linking it to districts in what is now Bangladesh. Since she is born on this side of the border, I'm surprised by the familiarity with which she recounts this history along with place names. Shumita's recollection of how this craft is practiced in villages of Bangladesh alerts us to the replication of memory and nostalgia that's not her own. So she hears these stories about kantha work from her mother and her father. All of them, she says, are from Bangladesh. And then there are many other people in this area, she says. Even today, if you cross the bypass is a major arterial road. To the other side, you'll find that almost 80% are from Bangladesh. Did they come here during the time of partition or when Bangladesh was formed? They have come at different times. And this is where she pauses and she says, I will not say anymore. And I'll come to the reason for that in a minute. The stories Shumita recounts are, the kanthas that were made in Horipur and Jashur. And she says there's a reason for that in those regions of Bangladesh, those are swampy areas, and there's a lot of water there. And she's heard that there was 27 to 28 feet of water, so the fields would be submerged most of the year. Sometimes they could grow paddy, and sometimes they could not. And when they couldn't farm, when there was water all around, there was no work to be done. There was no work in the paddy field. That was when women stayed home, and that was the time they made those kanthas. These stories, which she recounts, belongs to the oral culture of nostalgia that her parents and the larger extended family participate in. Indeed, it is not unusual for Bengalis who are on the Indian side to identify with villages and localities that the previous generation had left behind. As Bashabi Fraser put it in her introduction to Bengal partition stories, an unclosed chapter, whenever a Bengali from erstwhile East Bengal, later East Pakistan, and now Bangladesh, meets another Bengali, she or he always asks in the course of the introductory preliminaries, where are you from? The palimpsest reading of such a question would be deciphered as, are you from East Bengal? Which district? Endless repetition about the village left behind brings alive for Shumita's generation a rural life that she, by virtue of living so close to Kolkata, cannot hope to possess. Shumita consolidates the family memory as she speaks about the craft she now practices in another space, indeed in another country, and in another time and in a completely different context. It is the existence of this memory community that makes it possible for her to recall what is lost. But what Shumita recollects and recounts also conceals a subterranean stream of memory, what cannot be spoken about in front of strangers, but can be articulated only within a community that understands that migrants still cross the border to find work and build a life. It is this community that keeps memory alive and gives meaning to stories, and by extension, it is this memory community that keeps an unseen landscape alive. So this is what she hesitates to tell me when she says they have come at different times. They're still coming, but she says, I don't want to talk about that. We began with Jawaharlal Nehru's inaugural speech. Independent India had to redeem its pledge as it woke to life and freedom. This moment also signaled the freedom to choose a past that would hold the nation together. That past, I'm arguing, was a contentious one, and within 2 decades, the rough terrain was evened out and indeed refitted with a history that ended with the emergence of the Indian state. By the late 1960s, 2 decades after independence, the state began to actively foster sites of memory with statues of freedom fighters. After Mahatma Gandhi's assassination on 30 January 1948, nearly every city renamed one of its major streets after him, not to mention the innumerable statues that were now used to replace colonial statuary. This could perhaps be seen as the state's attempt to create an imagined community. It was not something that the refugees could relate to. For those displaced, the question remained, was this the new India that the freedom movement had promised? Most refugees who had lost their cherished homeland and entered this new nation in a state of being uprooted. The Bengali word for refugee is udbastu, which means being uprooted from his or her home or her bastu. They found this story of freedom promoted by the state very hard to make their own. But they found ways of building their lives. And as we see in this slide, this is Shumita's group that produces Kantha for a craft NGO. As they rebuilt their lives, refugees found that the only way the new boundaries drawn by the state could be transgressed was through memory, by recollecting a life elsewhere, where they had land, a home, and work that could keep body and soul together. Of course, these accounts were often sentimental and laced with nostalgia. They were also, in a sense, not real, but attempts to make sense of their past and give it a place in the present within which they were now ensconced. The boundary between past and present was often blurred in such recollections. Nostalgia, memories of another place, were not merely sentimental, but they were ways of active unbelonging. They challenged the heroic and national stories of the state. While many within the refugee community nurtured a deep hatred for the other community, in their nostalgic reconstruction, they created a space where friendships and mutual dependence seemed possible. Harking back to another time and place expresses perhaps an unwillingness to insert oneself into the history of independent India. It was a means indeed, the only means, by which those who experienced partition could hold on to a past which would never become history. The act of participating in a memory community is a way of possessing the lost past, of holding on to a sense of place without any territorial claims, and indicating a form of passive resistance to the agendas of the state, reminding us that memories shape human beings more than state agendas have ever cared to acknowledge. Perhaps this understanding can help us, oral historians, create new directions for our craft and demonstrate how we could use it for better understanding of forced migration, especially now when new lines are being drawn to define and dispossess refugees. It is oral history and its deep engagement with memory that can enable us to understand the past and the role it plays in the present, and push us to imagine new futures that might be possible for refugees, where they are not defined by dispossession, deprivation, and distress, but by the stories that they carry with them. Thank you very much. I would like to thank members of my family and who have helped me by giving their time to recollect things for me. A lot of them have passed away now. But I'd also like to thank people at Calcutta's CSSC Archives, the Sasha Archives, and my team at Center for Public History at Srishti Institute, Bangalore, which is now the Srishti-Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology. Thank you very much, Graham, for inviting me.
Thank you, Indira. That was fascinating and opens up a whole load of questions I'm sure people want to ask. But I'm just going to kick off because that's my privilege as chair, I think, of this session. So one of the first things I was going to ask you was, you talked a lot, I think you've really covered that period of silence exceptionally well and told us why the silence lasted so long from 47 to 98. But why did it break? What broke the silence?
That's interesting. I think it's the second generation that started asking these questions. And actually, the more I spoke to people who had been, who had seen partition or experienced it themselves, they said they weren't really silent about it. They really had, spoken to each other about what they had witnessed, but they did not dwell on it for too long. And of course, the filmmaker, the Ritwik Ghatak, they were not silent either. So I think when people refer to the silence, they are talking about the fact that the state did not really, recognize it. And the state did not, the history textbooks didn't talk about the refugee experience at all. So I think that is where this, people wanted to challenge that silence.
Mm-hmm. You speak about, I really like the idea of geographies of memory, but those were imagined communities, as you pointed out, not necessarily located communities. And I wondered how much was in post memory. So in other words, how much was being handed down to those children and how much wasn't being handed down to those children. So in other words, what were people prepared to talk to the children about and what were they not prepared to talk about?
That's interesting because, within these memory communities, certain stories that were about the village, that were about, the entire topography and what was available there, what I think a lot of people have looked upon as nostalgia, that is often handed down to children. But what is not handed down is the violence or, whatever trauma that they went through. But on the other hand, deprivation of food, of, how little you survived on, these are again stories handed down to children to almost because they hold the lessons of thrift or, how you survive, but certainly not violence. But I think sometimes in some cases, great deal of negativity and hatred against the other is also handed down. So it's not as if it's only nostalgia and only the good things. There is silence about, violence that you might have witnessed, but I think, there are ways in which certain, negative feelings about other communities are also handed down.
I also really picked up, and I really liked the connection between memory and the environment. And I thought you demonstrated that really well in terms of craft work, but how that fed back into memory as well. I wonder if you could talk a wee bit more about that, because obviously we at Newcastle have got a real interest in environment and memory at the moment.
Yeah, that's, what I found particularly interesting, with the craft work, is that she was telling us stories about villages she's never seen. And these are villages that her aunt or her father and this whole community that had migrated, in 47, that they were feeding her, they were telling her. And I find when I would talk to my uncle, when I was interviewing my uncle, he'd actually traced the whole journey of how they went home. And, where did they cross the river? Where was there a train? And there were all these details. So I felt that, there was a certain geography that they traversed in their minds. And it was, very alive for them. But the interesting thing is that this would often communicate itself to others in the family who had never been part of that community. And it would remain, almost as, that's what I call the memory community. It would remain alive there. And it is slightly different from post-memory, which is often in the second or third generation. These would be people of their generation, maybe the wives, who've not been there, but they feel that this is a part of the story and this is how, this community remains. And it is within this community that you can tell certain stories much more freely. For example, the Kantha worker, Shumita, she actually doesn't feel too comfortable talking about quote unquote refugees who are still coming. So I think that I felt was quite interesting, because she said they are still coming, but I don't want to talk about them.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question coming in here that says, what is the significance of family separation in the creation of memory communities? Were these ties strengthened by family units being kept together or being separated?
Well, I think, the separation of families, and our family was one of those families that experienced this separation. It made it very difficult, because I think the parts of the family that were separated, they had their own way of telling that story. And my great-grandmother, who actually was reunited with the rest of the family after the second Indo-Pakistan war that we had in 1965, because her husband died of old age around that time, and she couldn't live there anymore by herself. But when she comes back, there's a kind of dispersal, because she keeps talking about her home and things that were happening there as if she was still there. And nobody else in the family could participate in that, because it was too remote for them. For them, a certain past nostalgia was associated with her house, but not the kind of life she had led. So there is often, it's very difficult to say whether it gets stronger because of separation, or, it sort of weakens when everyone's together. But certainly the separation added to the strength of that nostalgia, that people, wanted to talk about what they had left behind.
I also wondered, there was another question come in, but I wondered also about, whether there was a sense of diasporic community. So, and actually whether the communities in the homeland knew about how their communities were being imagined. Does that make sense? Is there any sort of dialogue between Desh imagined and Desh actual?
I think what happened with a lot of people who came off and they kept thinking about Desh, they don't really think that if they go back, they'll see that Desh again. So Desh is really imagined. It's always imagined. There is no real Desh left anymore. And yet, if they meet somebody who still lives there, they just want to find out. And it's quite interesting because there is they don't share the same reality. So I think that itself is quite interesting.
Got another question coming in from Sandra. Do you think the intergenerational silence about certain topics is to do with a lack of comfortable narrative that both narrator and listener share? How can this gap be bridged?
Oh, it's difficult because I think sometimes that gap is unbridgeable for other reasons. For example, let's say the kind of education I had didn't help me to appreciate the kind of life my great grandmother had. I mean, today I can see that, I would have liked to talk to her more, but at that point, I didn't have the patience to listen to her stories. But I think, one thing that in the work we've done now with school children is to reignite an interest in the past and actually tell children that history begins at home. It begins with your grandparents. So go and find out, what they, and then it bridges that intergenerational gap. But I think this idea of, comfortable narrative, I don't know if a comfortable narrative really makes for a more vocal narrative, like, if it would make for less silences. I think there will always be silences between generations about, what you don't feel comfortable to talk about to your grandchild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And from Leanne, do you think these memory communities will continue to exist in the future as times change and we feel less connected to the past? Are future generations going to have the same connections?
Well, that's difficult to say, but on the other hand, there are studies now of, the third generation looking at the stories that they have inherited. And in fact, they are interesting responses because, there is puzzlement, let's say, from my friends in Bangladesh who feel, how can this young person who's grown up in another part of India, doesn't speak too much Bengali, still claim that, she comes from, or her family comes from this part, which is actually now in Bangladesh. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. But it makes sense only when you think that memory communities really try to pass on what had happened earlier to the next generation. It's almost like oral tradition, which we are surrounded by in India, that that becomes another way one generation passes on something to another. And the stories themselves are like oral legacies, if you like, which you then carry with you.
Yeah. I want to ask as well about that notion of the future. And, as oral historians, we know that a lot of people, a lot of talk of the past is actually a lot of talk about the future, actually. That people are combining both those things. And I wanted to ask about that in relation to why, particular stories of communities, is there a hope for a return to communities, or a hope to return to a unified India, for example, or what's playing out in terms of popular memory there?
I don't think that it, really reflects a hope that something will be healed or will become whole again in the future. I don't think they're really looking at that, but they feel that this memory of the past might actually give the present generation some strength for the future, because the future is always seen as this uncertain thing. And I think now with COVID, we all know how uncertain and how quickly things can become uncertain. So I feel that it is actually coming from a place of wisdom, that, you connect with maybe ancestors. Maybe that is what, that I'm struck by that album that I showed, which was my aunt's album. I never set eyes on it till, recently, much years after she had passed away. And there seems to be, this idea of trying to honor whoever you count as your ancestor, whether it's the ancestor from the family or the land, etc. So it's quite interesting that way. What kind of future? It's more like wisdom to cope with the future rather than the future itself.
Yeah, yeah. So almost like a resource.
Yes.
Okay, we've got a question coming in from Lorna. Are stories' messages now being passed on via other means? Music, art, dance?
Yes, I think so. I think, sometimes we don't know what to make of them. I mean, I discovered while doing my PhD that one of the songs my great-grandmother would sing, I actually found the written version of that song while doing my research at the India Office Library. And I said, oh, this was her song. And we used to laugh a lot about it because it was a funny song that was where the villagers were making fun of, the Babu from Calcutta who uses pomade on his hair. And, he's just a despicable character. And we didn't know why she would, tell us this elaborate story. But I realized that, the song may not immediately tell you about the family, but it does tell you about the kind of entertainment that was available, what was, being sung at that time. What does it tell us about the community and how that community lived? So I think, there is interesting work done by my friend Homi Bhabha, who's put together an archive called the Traveling Archive, where she has gone to Bangladesh and parts of West Bengal and interviewed singers and recorded their songs. And, when would they sing it? What is the story of that song? And when did that song change? So yes, there's quite a, there are other ways in which these memories are also passed on.
I mean, forgive my ignorance on this, but how much comparative work is now being done in terms of oral history in Bangladesh and India? And I want to come back as well and maybe ask you a wee bit more about Pakistan as well.
Well, we have tried at our center to bring together, and so has universities. We found that, our visa rules sometimes get in the way of our research. So we've tried to overcome those by now having, people from Pakistan speak via Skype. And now, of course, we haven't tried the Zoom platform. But certainly the, winter school in oral history that we hold every other year in Bangalore, we have invited people both from Pakistan and Bangladesh and, scholars in India, and have them talk about displacement and the partition. And the perspectives are quite different. And it's very, very interesting and enriching to listen to that discussion. And I think we should do more of that.
Yeah, yeah. So I've worked in Pakistan for a period, and what I found interesting was how you described the relationship between memory and space in India. And I think it is different in Pakistan, in terms of displacement, so that my understanding is in Pakistan there was more space available for people when they settled than in India. So there's a kind of different relationship between the land and how you use space in terms of displacement.
I think it was not only the availability of space, it was also the ideology of Pakistan. that, we have created this new nation, which you should feel proud to belong to. And for most of them, there was the sense of, I've come to a new land which belongs to me. But recent oral history work that has been done in Pakistan actually talks about the difficulties some of these people had when they couldn't really come back and visit their, the land where they were born in India. Because, as someone who really wants to do that, and, Anam Zakaria has talked very, very interestingly about these problems.
We've been told that we need to wrap up quite soon, but I've got one final question, which is about, and I really liked the way you finished the lecture with this idea of optimism and set out some of the roles of oral historians. And I really liked that in terms of refugee. And I just wondered if you just say something more about that, just to conclude our talk tonight.
I actually feel that that's part of a larger dream many of us have, that, when you read about refugees and see what they're doing, what is often not recognized is that, in their stories, they probably have another world. They have a whole knowledge system that goes unacknowledged. So perhaps oral history could be one of the ways in which we know what is it that they bring into this new country that they come to settle into. That they're just not people, who come in to, work in the industry as laborers. They might have a lot more. And a lot of oral historians have been looking at that in terms of music or in terms of, just knowing various things. So it would be very, very interesting. I mean, I see a lot of that work being done in Australia, in Italy, in various places. So, even, and USA, of course. So it would be interesting to actually integrate that into, how we work with refugees.
Indeed. Well, Professor Chowdhury, thank you very much for actually not just providing a very interesting agenda for oral history, but actually setting out some of the most interesting things I've heard this year in terms of communities of memory. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.